This is a Nintendo 64 system, but it's not just any Nintendo 64 system. It's one that I've been waiting to be able to do a video on for months now. See, I've been waiting for a product to show up in the mail after I pre-ordered it, or at least got put on a list for it. I want to say it was back in June. No, it would have actually been May. It would have been back in May, and that is an HDMI modification for this system, which enables it to play games with actual hardware through HDMI, so it's much more current and of course will be more compatible with pretty much every TV coming out now that seems to be eliminating those AV ports. This is an Ultra HDMI modded N64. I went ahead and I modded it myself. I kind of did it in my free time after it showed up about 3 weeks ago, but it is completed and we're going to check it out. I'm going to show you some of the footage and everything that I've captured from it with some comparison shots. And we're also going to be taking this guy apart and show you what the modification entails so you can decide if it's something you want to try doing or maybe you want to mail it away and try one of the services that are currently offered for doing it. Also, the light is now blue. Okay, so first thing, let's take a look at where the HDMI port is. It's actually right here. Now, I didn't do the best job cutting it out, but honestly, this system is more for practicality than anything else. It's not supposed to be pretty. This is mostly usable for capturing footage in case we ever need Nintendo 64 footage for any reason, which with the possibility of something like Nintendo 64 Classic coming up in the future, this would actually be pretty cool to use to maybe test some of the real games on real hardware against the emulated games on, just regular ARM chipset hardware that would probably be used in the Nintendo 64 Classic. But it comes out of here. It is a mini HDMI cable, so you have to convert it from mini HDMI to full HDMI, and then it'll work on your standard TV. It can upscale to 720p or 1080p. Usually I just do 720p straight up, and it works fairly well for what it's given. Remember, it is a 240p image in some cases. It can be higher with an expansion pack, which I don't actually have the expansion pack in this one. I did not put it in there when I was putting it back together. But it does use, it's essentially a 240p image that will get scaled up and moved around to more so reflect that when it's shown on the TV. So the image will still not be like, super clear at all times, but it will at least look pretty good comparative to the AV cables. Now we're going to start taking this guy apart, and in order to do that, we need a game bit driver that, of course, Nintendo used on a lot of their stuff at this time. The Super Nintendo used it, the Nintendo 64 used it, and the GameCube used it, and it was pretty annoying because you'd have to order way on eBay or China or whatnot to get these. You still do. Back then, you would have to do your best to find one somewhere, or you would just melt a pen, and that's what a lot of people did as well. So let's get these screws out and we can get this off. Okay, now that the screws and everything have fallen out of the bottom and gone everywhere, let's pop this guy open. There we go. Put that to the side. I also went ahead and cleaned the reset button because this one I got online. These were all sticky. Very easy for me to do that. This is actually all brown as well. That all comes apart through the back here. This actually comes right off with the screws, and you can take that off. You can pop these right out. So if yours get kind of sticky over time or they don't move as well as they used to, if you pop these all out and you just there's some metal springs in here, you pull those out, you can actually just drop this into like soapy water for like an hour or two, and then everything just wipes completely off and it looks almost brand new for those parts, and they feel brand new with the power and the reset. You can already see kind of the modification here where there's a ribbon cable running around, but I do have to remove some of this heat shield. Also, here is our blue LED that's in there. This was a drop-in replacement, which is great. They actually had them in stock where I got Ultra HDMI from, which I'll put in the description, but they are always sold out and always back ordered seemingly. So if you're gonna get one of these, you're gonna be waiting for a little while anyway. But this was a drop-in, had to solder in the 2 points. The old one came out, new one went in, and that was it. It works great. So I kind of like the blue just to make it look a little unique so it doesn't look like a completely stock system. I kind of like that. So we got to pull a couple of these screws out to get this board and this heat sink and part of the heat shield off. So we're going to do that now. Okay, with the main screws off, this will actually lift up, and then we can take a look at kind of the modification here that we have. And you can see the way this works is you essentially are pulling video directly from the main chip here. This should be the RRSP chip. I have to double check to make sure I have that right. But this is your RCP chip, RCP chip right here, and that is where the mod directs you to solder your leads to. They give you all of this, the cable that's all set up specially to work, that also pulls power from our capacitors here, and then it has another cable that runs down to the bottom here that will solder in 2 different spots depending on your model. The part that's the most scary, I think, to people is this part here, soldering all of these small leads to the legs of that RCP chip. And notably, it's not the easiest thing in the world if you don't have a lot of experience soldering chips, or really any soldering. If you don't have any experience in soldering, this might be something that you might want to actually take time and spend the money and have someone else do it for you. I have noticed that there are services where you can send this mod and your Nintendo 64 too, and they will actually kind of solder it all together and send it back to you, so you don't have to worry too much about it. This is not a project that I would learn to solder on. This is one I would go to after you have learned to solder and you're very confident with it. They want you to do things called drag soldering, which is essentially what I would end up doing for EEPROMs and stuff when I would make Super Nintendo games, for example, where you have several tiny legs and you essentially just put flux down and then you go along and solder each lead by essentially dragging your soldering iron along lightly. And it can have things happen where you bridge solder and legs together, which you would want to use solder wick to fix. So there is a lot of things really that can go wrong. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people won't take the time to do this themselves, because they're concerned, and I can understand that. But the results are really cool, and I really like the system so far for what it's able to do. Now, the way it works is it does connect to a board that's been installed down here, and that does all of the processing and converts the image and everything to make more sense to your big flat screen. And that board is the part that you saw back here where that port is. So this board is that port essentially. It's connected to it, that's why we cut that hole out, and it plugs into the back of there. So it pulls the actual video signals off of here, runs it down that board, processes it, and then kicks it out through that mini HDMI port to your TV. It's a cool idea, and honestly, it works well. There's a lot of modes to go through, and you can kind of customize it to your liking. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put this back together. We're gonna jump over to some gameplay footage of me playing different games, so that way you can kind of see how it all looks and everything, and if this would be something that you might want to take your Nintendo 64 and kind of work towards to either order the part and wait for a while or even have someone else do it.
Now that we looked at the hardware, let's see what you can expect from using the Ultra HDMI board compared to the stock composite out. You can access a menu that you see here from a button combination of ZR, C right, and D-pad right. This menu allows you to customize your image further, including different screen sizes with choices up to 1080p and tons of filters. There's even a low latency mode that works to minimize any lag, however you could encounter screen tearing when in this mode. For these comparisons, I left the menu at default settings. I also want to note that the composite recording from my capture card seemed to stretch the image somewhat, so keep that in mind for some of these videos coming up. You should still get the basic idea of the differences though. Alright, first up we got Mario 64, probably one of the most iconic games on the system. Here's a good shot of the window that'll give you an idea of the stretched on the composite side compared to HDMI. You can also note how much more colorful it looks with HDMI, which I think is the first thing I noticed when I turned it on, was just how much brighter everything looked for HDMI as opposed to composite, and that's probably because we are pulling directly from the chip as opposed to the N64 adding kind of its own anti-aliasing and stuff to it. But when you really look at this image, especially when Mario gets on screen here, and you compare them, yeah, you can see Mario looks like he ate a little too much spaghetti on the left with how stretched he is, but the biggest thing I took away from this was just how much more colorful and bright it looked on the HDMI side. And throughout this whole game, you'll see that with other levels, like for example when you're in the lava levels where you have fire and stuff, it was very bright. But that's probably the biggest thing you're going to see in a lot of these comparisons, are just how much more the colors pop through the HDMI side on the right. You can also see that some of the text is a bit more, I guess, legible or smoothed out. We're still working with that low resolution image, but it just looks so much better through HDMI with the colors popping. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 is a game that I played way too many hours of back in the day on the 64. I played it on the PlayStation 1 as well, and that's where I went to for the second game, but man, I played this a lot on the 64, no load times, and it ran really well. But look at it through HDMI compared to composite. It actually looks, this is one of the games that I was playing where I noticed it was very noticeable how much better it looked through HDMI. Again, brighter, yes, but if you look on even the ramp as I'm skating around on that half pipe, even like the text and graphics on there look a lot better. And it was just a much better experience going back and playing it through HDMI. Of course, it's a low, the visuals don't look amazing now, but at least the HDMI made everything look a little bit better with a brighter screen. Also, this game, way better than Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5. I have no idea how they messed it up when something like this game is just so simple and fun. Pod Racer is actually a game that uses the expansion pack that I do have installed in the 64 to put out a higher resolution image. Both of these shots are using that expansion pack with the higher resolution images, and you can notice it on, for example, your vehicle, your Pod Racer here, with different parts being a bit easier to see on HDMI. However, this is probably the game that I noticed, I guess, the least amount of differences. That might be because the game itself moves very, very fast. You can notice that it is interlaced more so through HDMI. I think it's just from the clear image. So when you're moving and things around you, like the environment fly by, you can kind of see that it's a bit more interlaced, whereas composite seems to dress that up a little more. But again, it does still look really good compared to the composite when you're playing on your bigger TV. And I do like this game a lot, and it does help with the expansion pack, but I actually think this is the one game that had the least amount of differences between the two. Yoshis Story is next. I didn't really play a lot of Yoshis Story back when the 64 was really popular. It is a 2D side-scrolling game, which is one of the reasons I wanted to use this in these tests, because it's a bit different than what you usually find on the 64. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to Kirby. That would have been a good one to test as well. But still, Yoshis Story actually ran really, really well on the 64 compared to a lot of games on the 64 with a low frame rate. This actually ran at a higher frame rate, which was great. And the HDMI side, you can see like the foreground's brighter and it's a bit easier to see the details. And again, this is one that just really pops off the screen with HDMI compared to composite next to it. You can see that kind of just blurs and is very dark compared to the HDMI side. Next up, we have another game that uses the expansion pack for the Nintendo 64, and that is Rogue Squadron. Now, I liked Rogue Squadron more on the GameCube. However, you look at this game and you really can see how great it looks on the Nintendo 64. Considering the specs from the system, this at the time was an awesome looking game, and if you have the expansion pack in, it does make it look that much better. Again, if you kind of look at these shots, you can see how much brighter it looks on the right through the HDMI out. And a game that already looks really, really good is just benefits from the HDMI. Even some of the text does look better. However, again, we're dealing with a bit of a stretched image on the left, so kind of pay more attention to the environments around it. Even the X-Wing itself, everything just really stands out from the screen itself. If you look on the right, it does pop away from the background a bit more, whereas everything's a bit darker on the left for composite out. So I couldn't do this test without checking out Starfox, since this, along with Mario 64, probably the two games I played the most on the system, since back then, if you got a game and you were younger, you just played it over and over and over again. And of course, Starfox kind of wanted you to do that anyway, with it being pretty quick to beat, and then of course having alternate paths and everything, and of course getting medals for each level. It was just a really fun game, and when I was playing it, it really did look a lot better with HDMI, as I expected, and I can't really explain why, but even the movement and motion felt a lot better going through HDMI. I don't know if it was because things were easier to see on the big screen with HDMI out, but just in general, it was a lot more fun to play with HDMI. So I'll admit, I was a bigger fan of the first BanjoKazooie game, not really as much BanjoTooie, but I think this game pushed the Nintendo 64 more than the first one, as the frame rate does seem to struggle a lot in this game. And I remember this being a darker game when I played back then. I think there was just more shadows and everything, and sometimes it was harder to see different parts of the game. And going back to it, I did notice that being the case. However, if I go from the left to the right, composite HDMI, you can see that it is brighter, and there are more details on things like the buildings or just original dark spots that I would have with shadows. And while other parts of it look like Banjo himself look better, I think again it was just the colors popping off the screen. This is a pretty colorful game, and really having HDMI out, getting the better colors, really does make a difference in this type of game. Now, it doesn't really fix the frame rate, because that time this game really struggled, and we're going to come up with another game soon that really had a hard time, but still, just the overall look of the game really improves. Beetle Adventure Racing. It's a game that I played a lot back then, mostly because I actually had this game and I think Lego Racers instead of Mario 64 or Mario Kart 64. I didn't have Mario Kart until later on, so I had this to play and Lego Racers as my two racing games. But I really liked Beetle Adventure Racing, mostly because the tracks themselves had tons of shortcuts. They had like little nitro boxes you could pick up. They had a bunch of numbered boxes as well, and you would try to collect those. But it was just a really fun game to play and race around in, and visually it was one of the better 64 games when it came to, I guess, just the environments and how they built up the levels. And again, the HDMI does help out with kind of cleaning up and kind of even clearing up parts of the level. As you're seeing me drive through kind of the city part, you can see more detail on the HDMI side, and it really does help out when you're racing around. There are parts where you go through different tunnels that are very shadowed, but then on the HDMI side, you can kind of see parts where you can turn in for a shortcut. So this actually does help in some way with the gameplay itself, because it's easier to see different parts and different branching paths you can take in the game. Really fun game though. If you've never played it, it's actually really fun to play against some people with. And lastly, we have Goldeneye, which Goldeneye is a game that I think most of us remember fondly, and then we go back and try to play it, and we realize we didn't have the kind of standards we have now. Of course, they were technically pushing barriers with this game. It doesn't run great. It doesn't look great either. The HDMI modification does try to help it, but distant enemies are still kind of a blurry mess and still hard to see, and it doesn't help at all with the frame rate. Now, I've heard that there is an expansion pack modification that you can activate with a GameShark code, and maybe I'll look into that when I get a GameShark. But for now, when I'm playing through this, it's not a great experience, obviously. I think that's why most of us want a Nintendo 64 Classic and have Nintendo maybe smooth it out, have it run better. But for now, this is kind of what we have just in general. And unfortunately, it doesn't run great. It doesn't look that great, but at least the Nintendo 64 HDMI modification makes it look better. I think just, again, the brightness and just the colors popping off the screen help more. But you still kind of have, well, what we've always known Goldeneye to be at this point, which is a fun shooter that just struggles with its frame rate and distant enemies and some of the visuals.
And that is the Ultra HDMI equipped N64. I like it a lot. It's great to have actual hardware run through HDMI. I think the games look very good for the source that it's coming from, generally being a somewhere between 240p and sometimes upper like 480p or so resolution image. And honestly, it's just great to have this essentially future-proof going forward, as AV ports are becoming a rarity on TVs now going forward, especially in 2018, definitely going into 2019 and 2020. So the fact that this will live on through HDMI is really, really cool. I might start doing this for a lot of my retro systems, whether it's the Dreamcast or I guess even a Saturn or anything else. HDMI is pretty much the way to go for a lot of these now. So I hope companies continue doing stuff like this, where you can get your own modification kit, install it yourself, or have someone else do it. So I hope this did give you a bit of a look at the 64 on the inside and then through gameplay, and kind of tell if you would want to get something like the Ultra HDMI for yourself, whether it's through a service, having someone else install it, or you try it yourself. Let me know what you guys think about the Ultra HDMI on the Nintendo 64. Make sure you guys do like the video if you like it. It does help out. And I'll see you guys in the next video.